Good afternoon, everyone.
I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodian of the land we meet today and pay my respect to their elder.
Past and present. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Then I pay my special respect to all the fallen heroes from Spring Revolution in Myanmar. And also thank this month AMI presenter, Mr. Morten and Mahmood Tuza. And I appreciate all our participants from different parts of the world for joining the AMI seminar today. Our AMI president, Nicholas Couple, will open the meeting. Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction. Welcome, everybody. Today, our webinar is going to be about the new UN Special Envoy for Myanmar, the Honourable Julie Bishop, who the United Nations Secretary General recently announced her appointment. We have two very distinguished speakers joining us today. The first is Dr. Morten Pedersen, and following him, it'll be Mo Thuzar, whom I will introduce more fully later. But first, Dr. Morten Pedersen, he's a senior lecturer in international politics at the University of New South Wales in Canberra at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and a former senior analyst for the International Crisis Group. He has been working on Myanmar politics and development affairs for more than 20 years and has served as a policy advisor to the Australian government, the United Nations, the European Commission, and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Martti Ahtisaari, among others. His major publications include A Good Office, 20 Years of UN Mediation in Myanmar. This book, which is a delightful short read and is a very good introduction to the role of the role that the United Nations has played in Myanmar. He's also the author of Principled Engagement, Negotiating Human Rights in Pariah States with David Kinley, and also the Rohingya Crisis, Myanmar, and R2P Black Holes. So without further ado, welcome, Morten. Thank you very much for agreeing to join us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicholas, and good to see everyone out there. I can't actually see most of you, but hopefully there's somebody there. Look, I'm going to talk for somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes, and then Mo Thuzar will follow up with her comments. I'm just going to, from time to time, try to bring in a slide, and I'm going to make an effort now, see if it works. So you will have to bear with me when I do that. So I thought it'd be useful to just remind everyone that Myanmar, or the UN, has been involved in mediation now in Myanmar for more than 30 years. And I thought it'd be interesting to just start by putting up the faces of all the key people involved in this. There's been a lot more people, of course, involved alongside them, but at the top we've got the 4 secretaries general who've had this mandate, and then below we've got the 7 now special envoys who have kind of carried the heavy load on the ground. I'll just get rid of that if I can. And then hopefully you can see me again. Now, the recent appointment of Julie Bishop, as I said, the 7th special envoy, has elicited, as I guess one would expect, quite sort of diverse commentary, right? We've seen that most governments have been strongly supportive. I suppose in some cases, perhaps because it means they can sort of pass the poison chalice onto someone else. But in any case, we've seen a more critical commentary from a number of independent analysts, some of whom at least have expressed the view that the envoy's mission is, well, either impossible or simply wrong-headed in some way, right? But I think there's a bit of confusion about what the envoy's mandate actually is. So I thought what I would do first is to just do a bit of a sort of a brush clearing exercise regarding the mandate. And then I'll have some comments on what I think Julie Bishop, as the current envoy, might most usefully do at this particular time. Now, as some of you may know, but probably not everybody, the envoy's or the envoy's mandate derives from the UN General Assembly, right? So every year, basically since 1993, the General Assembly has called on the UN Secretary General to, and I quote here, assist in the implementation of its annual resolutions on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. Now, that's important because if any of you have read these annual resolutions on human rights, which now I think the latest one ran to about 8 pages, there's a lot of things in there that the Secretary General and by extension his special envoy can potentially get engaged with, right? Now, the first Secretary General, Boutros Ghali, he listened to that request and then he said, okay, what I will do is that I will take the role of, I see my role as that of what he calls good officers, right? And that's basically a decision that without much discussion has been upheld ever since. So the role of the envoy is to offer their good officers. And what does that mean? Well, it's a term that goes back to the Hague Convention, so back in 1899, 1907, and basically refers in broad terms to this idea that the Secretary General has an independent political role in helping settle disputes between and within states. So that's kind of the principle or the formal background. Now, in addition to that, we have an initial framework agreement between the UN at the time, so back in the early 90s, and the Myanmar military government at the time, so SLORC, which basically states that they agree to engage in dialogue on 3 broad subjects. So one is the return to democracy, 2 is the reintegration of ethnic minorities into the political life of the nation, as they put it, and the 3rd is human rights and humanitarian issues, right? So you can see there, again, there's a very broad list of issues that the envoy can, in a sense, sort of pick and choose from. Now, within this broad framework, the focus of the specific envoys has shifted quite significantly over time. Basically in response to changes, of course, on the ground in Myanmar, what the main challenges of the time were, but also changes in international context. So in broad terms, for the first 16 years or so, until the transition from the SPDC to the Thein Sein government in 2011, until that, the UN was almost entirely focused on the implementation of the 1990 election results, or more specifically on getting Aung San Suu Kyi in office, right? Then after we had the transition to the Thein Sein government, there was sort of a sense, premature as it turned out, that this issue of democracy had sort of been at least partly resolved. So the focus shifted for the first time, importantly, for the first time, to what came to be talked about as the peace process, right? So the negotiations around the national ceasefire agreement. And that sort of was the case until about 2016. At that time, we actually had a brief interlude. Aung San Suu Kyi and her government told the UN that they didn't feel that the envoy's job was necessary anymore, so it was closed down for about a year. And then it was opened up again in 2018 or late 2017, now specifically focused on the Rohingya crisis, right, and the terrible circumstances around that. And then, of course, the coup happened in 2021, and then the focus shifted again. And since then, I suppose the main focus has been on ending the violence, right, but in broader terms, on the restoration of democracy. So the point I'm trying to make here up front is that given how wide the scope of the Special Envoy's mandate is, both in terms of the issues involved, the actors involved, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to say up front that the mission is impossible, or for that matter, wrong-headed, right? The real issue for me is not whether we should have a UN envoy. I think absolutely we should. That's a personal opinion. But the more interesting issue is how should the envoy go about doing that job, right? What can they do, or how should they do it to maximize their potential contribution, however limited that might be in the end, to alleviating or ideally resolving the multiple crises that are affecting Myanmar, right? So with that in mind, I want to just share some brief ideas about what he might do. I'll try to draw a few lessons from the past, but mainly I want to focus on the needs and the challenges in the current environment. Now, I actually had a slide for this as well, but since I was so fumbling with getting it up and wasting time, I'm not going to bring it up. I'm just going to talk to you. Now, the primary job of the envoy obviously is to work with the domestic parties writ large to try to help alleviate the multiple conflicts that they are engaged in some way, right? But to have any hope of making progress on that front, it will, of course, be necessary for the envoy, just as previous envoys have done, to also try to bring the international community together behind, well, at least ideally, a sort of more coherent and coordinated response to the crisis, right? And finally, and this is kind of a third element, there's often at least discussion about to what extent the envoy can help also give greater direction to the work of the United Nations system itself, right? So if you can imagine the slide that I'm not showing you, I have kind of three circles, three areas that the envoy probably need to focus on, right? So we are actually now extending the scope of her mandate even further, right? So that there's an awful lot of things on the shelves that Julie Bishop now can choose between, and probably even more that I haven't even thought about to this point, right? But if we go through each of these circles just very briefly, when it comes to the domestic situation, if you look back over the past 30 years of UN mediation, I think it's fair to say that there hasn't been any major achievements in that period. But I think it's equally fair to say, as Sofia Busch and I conclude in the book on the first 20 years of the mediation effort that Nicholas showed you before, that by and large, at least in our view, the role of the envoys has been constructive and in fact sometimes even productive, leading to some smaller successes, if you will. Now, at some time, at certain periods, it's been possible for the envoy to be very proactive, to sort of forge ahead and really try to push things. At other times, they have been sort of required to sort of hang back, work quietly in the background. But throughout these 30 years, as I see it, they have played quite a key role in keeping the lines of communication open, if nothing else, with all of the different actors involved in these conflicts. And then once in a while, when these actors were willing to talk to each other, well, then they could take on a more typical sort of mediating role, a go-between role between the different actors, right? You can't do that if the actors are not willing to be mediated, right? And at this point in time, I think it's fair to say that there's not a whole lot of space for that. So I concur with quite a few commentators who have said this is not the time to fly to Naypyidaw and try to persuade the generals to engage in some kind of deal. The only deal that's on the table anyway is for them to surrender, right? So in terms of the way we traditionally think about mediation, no, that's not what we need now. But I do think we need to get serious about or continue what we might call pre-mediation. And by that, I basically mean reach out to all the different parties as widely as we can, or the envoy can, and sort of begin to have a dialogue with them, try to understand their perspectives, build some personal relationships, maybe help them prepare for future negotiations. Now, as far as the military goes, the military government in Naypyidaw, I think really all that is relevant at this point is to maybe reestablish, if possible, a channel of communication. But when it comes to the resistance, the anti-junta forces, and everything that comes with that, I think there's quite a lot of work to be done in terms of, in a sense, mediating between them, right, to help them, support them in trying to work out sort of a common approach to things, right? Develop a common vision for the future, because I think it's fair to say that if they won the civil war tomorrow, the military was pushed aside. There are a lot of different views on how to proceed from there, right? So the further we can get towards a more common view on that, the easier it will be when hopefully that victory arrives. Now, in the meantime, and very important, I think, there's a lot to be done in the humanitarian space, right? And here I'm not just talking about what does seem to be a bit of a dead end, trying to persuade the military to allow further access through the sender. I'm not saying we should stop doing that, but I think the more important issues are around direct aid, as a lot of people have said, to community-based organizations, cross-border aid. The Rohingya are now back in the headlines in a very big way. They should never have been out of them, but they were. Very serious humanitarian situation developing up in the northwest, right? So these are all issues which I think should be on the table for Julie Bishop. Now, very quickly on the last two circles, when it comes to the international community, what past envoys have usually done is that they try to play a role as conveners of the international community. There's been a number of what we usually call groups of friends put together. Basically, the idea being that these groups would work together to try to nudge things in the right direction. My view is that in the current situation, the divisions in the international community are so deep and wide that I can't really imagine how a useful group of friends would be put together. But I do think there's some very important work for Julie Bishop to do in terms of perhaps trying to mobilize smaller groups of countries. That's all the rage these days anyway, right? We don't do multilateralism, we do unilateralism. That's the new black. She has a job to do in that. And I'm particularly thinking here about maybe trying to convene and mobilize the immediate neighbors to Myanmar around a more effective cross-border humanitarian assistance. And the Thais, as most of you would know, have kind of opened the door to that a little bit. The Chinese are active in that. So I think there's some work to do there. Now, the final circle, and keeping an eye on the clock here, I'm running out of time. There's often an assumption that the special envoy is kind of sitting on top of the UN system and should, or at least could potentially play a role in kind of giving direction to the UN system as a whole. I think in the past, most envoys have not even tried, and the few who tried to do this were usually not very successful. In fact, in a few cases, they were actively blocked in terms of their own efforts by other parts of the UN system. At the moment, the UN system, and I should be careful what I say here so I don't offend too many people, but I think the UN system as a whole is probably as dysfunctional as it has been at any time. And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, I don't see a whole lot of active support from the Secretary General, from at least the last couple of UN special envoys. That will need to change for Julie Bishop to be more effective. The country team is weakened by the long absence of a resident coordinator. So, of course, there is some coordination going on, but that could be a lot more effective. And I think there's a problem with figuring out what the role of, I think there's about 20 UN agencies on the ground at the moment, what their role is in an active war situation, because a lot of the work that is being done at the moment don't seem to be particularly relevant to the current situation. It would be great, anything Julie Bishop could potentially do to give direction, herd all these cats that make up the UN system would be great. I'm not very hopeful on that. I'm not even sure I would advise her to try. So I will, my final word for now at least would be that I think what she needs to focus on vis-a-vis the UN as a whole is actually to protect the unique mission that she has, the uniqueness that is the good offices, because there's a lot of pressure on her office, on her role to basically become kind of a second human rights rapporteur, right? So to focus on criticizing, if you will. Well, I guess my point is we already have a human rights rapporteur. We don't need another one. In order for the UN envoy, a special envoy, to play a useful role, they need to stay away from that, and they need to work in the background, try to be a bit more quiet about some of those issues, let the rapporteur do the public criticism, and then they should focus, Julie Bishop should focus instead on that sort of mediation role that is more specific to her mandate. So final word on this, I do believe that the UN Special Envoy at least potentially have a key role to play in terms of the international response, but I also believe that the job that Julie Bishop has just taken over is probably as hard or harder than it has ever been before. So we would all do well to limit our expectations, right? And perhaps one of her main roles initially will actually be to manage expectations, right? It would be very dangerous to suggest that more is achievable than seems feasible. So on that note, let me hand over to Motusa. Thanks.
Thank you, Morten.
Morten, thank you very much for that very informed and very candid assessment. We'll have questions for you at the end, but I think we'll turn first to our second speaker, Mo Thusar. Mo, I'll introduce her briefly. She is a senior fellow at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, where she coordinates its Myanmar studies program. Mo joined ICAS in 2008 as the lead researcher in the ASEAN Studies Centre up to August 2019. And prior to joining them, she spent 10 years at the ASEAN Secretariat, where she headed the Human Development Unit. A former diplomat, she researched Burma's foreign policy implementation for the period 1948 to 88 for her PhD at the National University of Singapore. Mo was a Fox International Fellow at Yale University's Macmillan Center during her PhD candidacy. Her research interests include Myanmar's foreign policy, ASEAN integration impacts and issues, and ASEAN's dialogue relations. ASEAN integration impacts and issues is of a particular interest to her. Mo has co-authored, co-edited, and contributed to several compendia and edited volumes on ASEAN and on Myanmar. A very distinguished speaker, Mo, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Koppel, for the generous introduction. Very good afternoon to everyone gathered around the Zoom screen this afternoon from Singapore. Greetings from Singapore. And of course, I'd like to express my thanks also to the Australia-Myanmar Institute for inviting me, for having me as a speaker. I follow the panel discussions as regularly as I can. And a special thanks to Morten for sharing the presentation space and also laying out a very comprehensive context about the UN envoy's mandate and mission and what might be expected. The clock I have, I think it's about 6 minutes to the half hour. I'll try not to take up too much time beyond the half hour. And I'd like to spend the time I have to provide more context to the current landscape, which Morten has laid out so well, to see where there might be some possibilities to work on initially. Very much aware that we are working within and under imperfect circumstances and conditions, and also aware of the overlap in the mandate or mission to offer good offices, whether it's the UN or whether, closer to this region, it's ASEAN. And as Ambassador Koppel has highlighted in introducing me, where I come from, where my research interest lies, is really that intersection of ASEAN and its interactions with Myanmar. So my working assumption is that everyone present in this Zoom session are familiar with ASEAN's 5-point consensus, which the 9 ASEAN heads of state and government negotiated with Senior General Min Aung Hlaing in April 2021, but which the Senior General later tried to conflate with the State Administration Council's 5-point roadmap. And that non-compliance has cost the SAC regime its seat at the high table, so to speak, which is now restricted to a non-political representative at senior official level only. So I'd like to make 3 broad points in the time that I have. And the first point is to dig deeper into the regional landscape, because the UN Special Envoy dealing with a situation like the ongoing conflict in Myanmar will come up against what the regional landscape is, what are the regional sentiments. And I'd like to take the next couple of minutes to share some summary slides about the sentiments that people clued into, or people who are very much informed of policy and regional geopolitics have to say about the Myanmar crisis and ASEAN's response. So in 2022, what we managed to get is whether or not views in Southeast Asia among so-called policy elites thought about ASEAN's response to the Myanmar crisis. So as you can see here, it seems almost equally split between approving, disapproving, or just wanting to stay out of it by saying I'm neutral. Of course, the strongest disapproval, this was like fresh after the coup when we were doing the survey. So Myanmar respondents were overwhelmingly disapproving. And the next highest disapproval came from Thailand and Singapore, as you can see. Strongest approval, Brunei and Indonesia. Brunei was ASEAN chair in 2021. Indonesia was going to take up ASEAN chairmanship in 2023. But I should also note that at the country level, approval ratings were higher in Singapore than disapproval. We also asked the question about how to move the issue forward. And what we found regionally, there was more of an appetite to engage in independent dialogue with all key stakeholders in Myanmar to build trust. There was also an appetite to have a coordinated and unified response with international partners. And as the summary slide shows, there were also other options that received varying degrees of preference. Now, in 2023, we see that the 1/3 preference for neutrality continued, but views were emerging that the 5-point consensus could not work because of the State Administration Council junta's intransigence. And there are also views, mainly from Myanmar respondents, that the 5-point consensus was fundamentally flawed. Again, questions related to how do we move the issue forward. We found that the preference for engaging in independent dialogue with all key stakeholders actually increased in 2023 from the previous year, but preferences for mounting a coordinated and unified response with international partners decreased. And there were varying, not much variance apart from, I think, the preferences to expel Myanmar from ASEAN and readmitting at a later date increasing. So that was last year. Now, fast forward to this year, and compared to last year, what we see is that the views that the 5-point consensus will not work because the main culprit holding it up is the SAC remains. As well as the 1/3 preference of wanting not to make any kind of position statement whatsoever. Regarding moving the issue forward, the preference to engage in independent dialogue with all key stakeholders in Myanmar continues to be the most prevalent preference regionally, and at country levels, countries such as Indonesia and Myanmar respondents as well as from Philippines and Laos, continue to give this the highest ratings at the individual country level. So this is just a quick kind of a taste, if you will, of the survey findings related to ASEAN's Myanmar response, which gives us an indication as to how the region's policy elites, or those who are in a position to inform or influence policy, are thinking about responses. So the current situation, 3 years and counting, of course, I think has also showed, as Morten has highlighted, individual attempts at mediation or through either the UN or the ASEAN systems also being blocked by different or differing interests. And the UN and ASEAN special envoys, not to mention other envoys on Myanmar appointed by different governments, have also not been able to discuss or dialogue regularly among themselves. And neither have ASEAN and its dialogue partners, including the United Nations for that matter, being able to dialogue or discuss regularly among themselves. Of course, I note here also that the ASEAN Special Envoy position is that representing the ASEAN chair, which rotates annually, I think, which adds to more of the imperfect conditions and circumstances. And prior to 2021 and the 5-point consensus mandate, ASEAN only has that one prior experience of assigning a senior official as its envoy to Myanmar. And that was in 2006, as I recall. It was the Malaysian foreign minister at that time. But even then, there were delays in getting the regime in Myanmar at that time to agree to each trips. And in both trips, the ASEAN envoy did not manage to meet with either Aung San Suu Kyi or members of the opposition. But interestingly enough, the ASEAN envoy at that time did meet with the UN Special Envoy, Dr. Ibrahim Gambari, as I recall, in 2007, who was dispatched by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to meet with several governments in Asia, including those of neighbors as well as some members of ASEAN, about the situation in Myanmar. So for me, that is like the UN seeking support from ASEAN and neighboring countries to address the crisis in Myanmar. But what we see after 2021, especially at the 1-year mark of the 5-point consensus, is ASEAN inviting external partners and other approaches to support the implementation of the 5-point consensus. So it's an admission that ASEAN cannot go it alone, and an appeal to the dialogue partners of ASEAN, including UN, and of course those with significant investment and economic interests in Myanmar, to cooperate or to coordinate responses. But even so, I also agree with what Morten mentioned about a group of friends idea and a common plan not being the most appropriate or the workable approach at the moment. And I also agree with the need to explore a concerted approach or coordinating cross-border actions among or with smaller groups. So I would view this as the first concentric circle, if you will. And I think ASEAN should really step up its convener role at the very least, because what we see is everyone paying lip service to ASEAN's centrality, including the ASEAN member states. But what does that really mean? If it's clear that ASEAN cannot do it alone, and if it's clear that neither can the UN in the present moment, how might then ASEAN and UN as dialogue partners and as the entities with membership support be able to coordinate a working level response, at least for more effective and responsive cross-border assistance? The second point I'd like to quickly make is just really to look back on ASEAN's past experience with Myanmar since 2003. Morten mentioned about 3 decades of the UN efforts in Myanmar. ASEAN has about 2 decades of similar efforts. But what I note here is really that ASEAN's way of pressuring Myanmar diplomatically, really no other ASEAN member has had its rotational turn as ASEAN chair deferred. In Myanmar's case, twice. Nor any other ASEAN member has had its seat at the summit and at foreign ministers' meetings limited to a non-political representative only. And not only that, ASEAN has actually continued to place Myanmar on its regional discussion agenda as a way of monitoring what's going on, particularly after the Debayan massacre incident in 2003. And ASEAN's way of keeping Myanmar on the regional discussion agenda is really to put the pressure on whoever attends the meetings to give updates, to answer questions, difficult questions, and not to let up that kind of questioning. But even so, The 2003 Daban incident also compelled the State Peace and Development Council regime to come up with a 7-step roadmap for democracy, which became the framework for monitoring, quote unquote, progress on the situation in Myanmar. And of course, with the way that the steps taken for convening elections, for bringing members of parliament into the Hluttaw, Myanmar's parliament, and then electing the executive, all of these were supposed to be implementing the 7-step roadmap. And of course, after the Thein Sein administration took office, the situation in Myanmar kind of disappeared from the ASEAN agenda, but reappeared again after the 2017 Rohingya exodus. And we have seen now, since 2021, paragraphs on Myanmar in ASEAN statements having 2 components: the pending repatriation and the safety situation of the Rohingya, and the conflict that erupted in Myanmar since the use of lethal force against civilian protesters after the 2021 coup. So that's how I guess the UN and ASEAN intersection is. ASEAN actually attempted to invite Dr. Ibrahim Gambari, the UN Special Envoy, to brief ASEAN leaders at the summit in Singapore in 2007 after his fact-finding mission about the Saffron Revolution. But the Myanmar government at that time, represented by Prime Minister Thein Sein at that time under SPDC, objected, and therefore ASEAN could not bring the UN Special Envoy to brief it, but they held separate bilateral briefings. So, but then again, when Cyclone Nargis happened in May 2008, what we see is the ASEAN member states and the UN Secretary General intervening directly and coordinating together with or without any special envoys, good officers at that time. So my final point here, and I'm conscious of the time ticking, what might a future action agenda look like? Expanding on Morten's thoughts, I agree, Morten, about the humanitarian assistance urgency. And as we have seen, the UN Special Envoy's mandate covers the Rohingya crisis since 2017. ASEAN has also placed Myanmar back on its regional discussion agenda since then on that topic. And I also agree with you, Morten, about the importance for preparing and progressing small steps, either in knowledge, in capacity, in awareness, in communication, as part of that preparations toward a time when things might become more possible. So as the State of Southeast Asia survey findings indicate, talking to all stakeholders sans exception continues to be important, but that needs to be managed in a way that I think the current UN Special Envoys working on maneuvering space also does not end up becoming compromised like her predecessors. And at the same time, there is increasing awareness that, the various stakeholders and actors in Myanmar do require more support in space to discuss and decide on their country's future, including dealing with the impact of and challenges that are exacerbated by the current spiral of conflict. So I think we need to make humanitarian assistance more meaningful. And of course, we also need to see where we can help to build more capacities for change in preparation. And I think for ASEAN, for UN, for the international community, the main imperative of the Myanmar response still seems to be fixated on, of course, halting the ongoing spiral of violence before any other steps can be taken. But Morten has already highlighted, it's not waiting for things to kind of like be raised and then step in. I think it's still vital to continue efforts to leverage support and hold the military regime accountable. But new realities that we have seen, particularly since October 2023 and Operation 1027, I think may now require alternative strategies that make use of all the back channels that we can have. But of course, Myanmar's complex political and ethnic landscape means that the process towards change, the process of change, will be long and challenging. I apologize for going over time. I'll stop here now and wait for questions and comments.
Thank you, Ma. Thank you, Ma. So, Nicholas.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mo. That's it's not a problem going a little bit over time. That was very interesting. I'll just invite anyone who's watching or listening in who might have a question to put them in the chat room, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. While you're thinking of questions, I might kick off, Morten, with a comment and a question to you. I mean, you talked about the importance for Julie Bishop to be managing expectations, and the difficulty in doing that, given I think, if I understand it correctly, quite a bit of ambiguity about what her particular role is. You use the word confusion, but I think that confusion is quite reasonable. I mean, the Secretary General's press release didn't specify what her role is at all, simply said she has been appointed. There was a UN spokesperson who, in advance of the announcement of Julie's appointment, said that the role of the special envoy, didn't use the word role, was to engage with ASEAN member states and all stakeholders to advance a Myanmar-led political solution to the crisis. And then the UN General Assembly's resolution on Myanmar, which predates, of course, the special envoy, talks about the UN working closely with ASEAN so even to me, reading all these various things, I'm left a bit unclear. You know, what is the job description of the special envoy? It doesn't seem to exist publicly. Do you think, does it exist privately? Will there be a letter from the Secretary General to the special envoy setting out his expectations of her in this role?
No, I'm quite sure there won't be, because that would be totally out of line with how he's been dealing with Myanmar more generally, right? There's sort of more in the back seat, making some comment from time to time when something really bad is happening. I think it will be up to her. I mean, there will be lots of other people who will try to tell her what to do, right? I don't think the Antonio Guterres will be one of them, but I'm absolutely certain that I could draw up a list of about 100 people who would no doubt try to tell her what her job is. So I guess my slightly longer answer to what you didn't ask about is that it is really, really important, and I'm sure that's what she's doing now, is that she does her own homework, talk to as many people as she can, think about things, and then she make up her own mind about where she can most usefully play a role. And obviously, given that she is the one who's going to be playing this role, she will be the first to learn what works and what doesn't, right? And therefore be much better able than anyone else to adjust, do the lessons learned as she moves along. So final word on that, tell the world as little as possible about exactly what you're doing, just a few headlines, right? Don't do any media interviews where you get caught out. If you need to tell the world something that means anything, write an op-ed instead. And what I'm saying this on the basis of 20, almost 30 years of experience, where several of, in my case, just watching things, right? But UN experience, where we've seen, I think, 2 or 3 of those special envoys get seriously burned by speaking out in the media. So that would be a key thing for her to consider also in terms of managing expectations.
Thank you. And Mo, if I could put a question to you as well. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about and analysis focused on disunity within ASEAN over how to respond to the Myanmar crisis. And I think some of the results of that survey reflect quite a split in perspectives amongst the elite in the region. How, given that the UN is, and many of the dialogue partners are determined to support ASEAN in implementing the 5-point consensus, or to ASEAN's lead in resolving the crisis in Myanmar, how then should the special envoy help, and what way can the special envoy support ASEAN best, given the split within ASEAN?
Yes, I mean, I think that's the perennial challenge, because we see ASEAN's collective decision, which everyone has undertaken to uphold, which they are still holding the line. But if sentiments are veering towards, okay, this approach is not working, what next do we do? Do we adopt a softer stance? Not that I'm saying that ASEAN is thinking it, but if people start thinking about it, then it's very easy to start along that slippery slope. And of course, I mean, the main point here is not to be seen as rewarding the SAC for non-compliance. So I think that's where I think the divergence come in, because a lot of the ASEAN member states, of course, do not want the broader regional integration efforts to be held hostage to or jeopardized by what's going on in Myanmar. And yet, what's going on in Myanmar, the Myanmar conflict since 2021, particularly September 2021 onwards, the spiral of violence really shows that what happens in one member state, of course, affects the whole region, including regional stability. So the neighboring countries, of course, have different views. So sometimes we used to call this like the mainland maritime divide, in the sense that the more pragmatic or practical attitudes would be expressed by, say, countries that share long borders with Myanmar. But at the same time, we also need to look at how the so-called institutional memory in ASEAN when it comes to interacting with different military regimes in Myanmar comes about. And of course, even before Myanmar became an ASEAN member, the country that had long borders, that had bilateral interactions the most, was Thailand. And so, of course, we see this kind of a role that Thailand has with regard to its institutional role and memory. But let's also not forget, around 2003 or so, Prime Minister Thaksin also wanted to initiate the Bangkok process, which was not received that favorably by the generals in Naypyidaw. So we have all that, but I think the differing views really accrue to how best to deal with this situation, with this crisis in Myanmar, through the channels available to ASEAN. And of course, I think ASEAN's interest to, as we can see in the statements that the leaders issue reviewing the 5-point consensus, ASEAN's interest to see whether or not there could be this kind of multi-pronged approach, as it were. But we've also seen the declining appetite for something that's internationally coordinated. And really, if you ask me, it also depends on what are the various domestic interests and priorities. So every country will have their own national interests and domestic priorities foremost. And of course, what is distracting attention internationally also distracts attention regionally, I would say.
Right. We have a question come in from David Carew, which Morten has answered online, but maybe, Mo, you would like to comment as well. David asks, would recognition of the NUG as the legitimate representative government of Myanmar by a few countries, including some from ASEAN, help or hinder the work of the Special Envoy and the end to the civil war? Would you like to comment on that? Morten's response, I should say, is that he thinks it would cause the SAC to not only ignore but lash out against the
legitimacy question.
Yes, whether recognizing the national unity government.
I think that's the thing. I mean, I wrote about this sometime in late 2021 about legitimacy being the name of the game for both sides of the political divide. Of course, the State Administration Council is asserting that it is the legitimate representative. And at the same time, the elected representatives from the 2020 elections, which have gone on to form the CRPH, the committee representing Pidang Suluto, and then the appointing the NUG, of course, are also asserting that they legitimately represent the interests, the voice, the will of the Myanmar people. But I would posit here that what the NUG is doing, the NUG can do what it's doing without necessarily having that additional conferment of legitimacy, because there are interactions, there are, I think, supportive conversations and things going on. And at the same time, we haven't really seen many governments around the globe in this region actually according the SAC any formal recognition. So this is really different from the post-1988 situation as well. And I think that kind of the interactions that are going on right now would would help, I think, the work of the special envoy, because I remember Dr. Nolene Hazer making it a point to also reach out to the NUG, talk to them, and find out their needs and interests and so on. And her focus was on bringing about this inclusive humanitarian forum, as you will recall. But that idea, which actually most of the Myanmar stakeholders agreed to, needed time to, I think, be digested broadly as a regional initiative. And I think that's where we saw roadblocks and obstacles coming up. So that's kind of like my long-winded rambling take on the legitimacy question. There are things that can be done with or without, I think, conferring legitimacy, but actually continuing interactions in a much more meaningful way.
Yes, I think that would be my assessment as well. And indeed, the question of, well, an act of formal recognition would make the job of the special envoy and indeed progress on any of those mediation efforts much more difficult. But these, of course, the informal and dialogue with all the parties is crucial going forward. And you wouldn't want an act of formal recognition to interfere with substantive progress. We have a question in from Felix Haas, who asks, would you see specific openings such as available platforms or contacts, for example, with Naypyidaw or regional countries, that specifically would be available to an Australian special envoy of the Secretary General, which may be more advantageous for de-escalation or support to humanitarian assistance than the appointment of a regional special envoy? So this is getting to the question, obviously, of the nationality of the special envoy. Perhaps, Mo, you could address that first.
Right. Thanks, Felix, for the question. Very pertinent in view also that there are a lot of sub-regional initiatives that have started that really try to maybe build on or expand on the existing contacts or platforms that different countries in the region have with Naypyidaw. Of course, the special envoy of the ASEAN chair, as the title and name connotes, is not the envoy of ASEAN. It's of the ASEAN chair, which rotates annually. But to kind of get around that and to ensure continuity, ASEAN has tried to reinstitute its ASEAN Troika mechanism, which involves inputs from both past, present, as well as incoming ASEAN chairs to provide that continuity. And now there's a discussion of ASEAN Troika Plus to recognize the role of countries that do have significant interest, interaction, and institutional memory on Myanmar, such as Thailand. So I think we need to look at it in that sense rather than imbuing or investing everything that needs to be done in the person of the special envoy, which is still very much going to be the representative of his or her head of state and government for that rotational year that ASEAN has. I think the point here that we need to look at is, as I mentioned, how do then the different special envoys, UN and ASEAN mainly here, coordinate or have a dialogue? I think during Dr. Nolene Hazer's time, we did see and hear of attempts of Dr. Hazer to talk to her ASEAN counterparts to really find out what the Indonesian chair was thinking. But we also saw a rather unique situation where Indonesia, as ASEAN chair, appointed an office of the special envoy, but we didn't really see actions from the special envoy as such, although we all understood that that was the foreign minister. So we've seen the Laos chair, the special envoy under the Laos chairmanship now continue on some of those, I think, plus points that the Indonesia chairmanship of ASEAN in 2023 introduced, which was to talk to all stakeholders. But Laos is approaching it in a much less low-key, low-profile, much less publicized way than what I think the Indonesian chair did. So I think we need to take all of these dynamics into consideration, as well as look at where the smaller sub-regional efforts and so on actually can feed into the regional whole without seeming to go off on an independent tangent. And that's where also the UN Special Envoy's, I think, mandate and I guess the good officers part of the interactions and dialogue would come in with different ASEAN governments.
Martin, Denise Nichols asks, what role should Australia play in supporting the envoy's role within the ASEAN context?
Yeah, so I think my answer to that will be very short. So I'll give that first, and then if you will allow me, just a brief reflection on the previous question. Sure. Denise, I think, I mean, first of all, and that's perhaps obvious, is that, you know, the Julie Bishop is now the envoy of the UN, and it's very important that she's not seen to be the envoy of Australia. So whatever role the Australian government plays in all of this, it should be, you know, quietly in the background, right? But having said that, I think there are a number of examples in the past, at least, where the countries from where the envoys were from, where they contributed resources in various ways, in perhaps in areas where they saw a particular interest in doing more than the envoys were able to do, with what I should emphasize is a very, very limited resources available to them, right? The UN Special Envoy and their office is small and has very little money available, right? So it's possible that there's certain things that could be funded, if you will, and not just by the Australians, right? As far as Felix's question goes, I guess the obvious sort of part of the answer is that Australia is very focused on the region and has been, of course, for decades. Julie Bishop herself must have, I haven't looked at her travel schedule or anything else, her diary from the time she was foreign minister, but she must have a lot of high-level contacts and personal confidence and so on in the region, right? So obviously one would expect her to draw on those. The question then is, for what purpose, right? What do we want? What do we need the region to do? And to just round things off, my view would be, for the moment, potentially there's a role for the region in mediation later on, but as I said earlier, I don't think that's quite the time for that yet. So it is the humanitarian side of things that I think should be the priority as far as the region goes at this particular time. So anything she can do to pull countries together around that, using her own and personal and sort of national contacts, I think would be a key priority for her.
Thank you for that. We're getting close to our closing time, but there is one further question. Anonymous that has come in. Given that ASEAN is not a vehicle for political engagement, I'm not sure about that, and the inability for enforcing or implementation of the 5-point consensus, what sort of practical issues should Julie be engaged when thinking of engaging with ASEAN, other than the humanitarian issues and support? Would either or both of you like to comment on that?
Okay, I'll take a quick stab at it and also wrap that into my closing remarks, because I know that the time is approaching. I think the whole important point is that, you know, instability in Myanmar means instability in the region, and Myanmar is a land bridge between South and Southeast Asia. It could be seen as the crossroads of Asia. So I think it's in everyone's interest to really look at how we can really coordinate or work together to mitigate the impacts of what we're seeing now: extreme migration, all these transnational crimes activities rising. Okay, beyond the health, reputation, and unity of ASEAN, of course, we also need to look at the extraordinary human cost, the lost potential, and see where we can help the people of Myanmar. So yes, humanitarian assistance, making it more meaningful, seems almost like a tried and tired trope, but I think we really need to look at that, as well as also engaging with and supporting the broad resistance, the NUG, the ethnic armed groups, and so on, to foster unity. Because if the future vision is something that is going towards either federalism or confederation or whatever, I mean, I think it's in all our interest to see and how we can minimize the fracture element and maybe help to maximize the potential of the federalized element. And that requires preparing for both near term, which which would mean supporting capacities for local autonomy, local governance, providing services at local levels, and the longer term visions. And that, of course, starts with fostering more discussion and communication with the different stakeholders.
Thank you. Morten, would you like to add to that or have a final comment?
Yeah, no, I can. And I was just looking at Trevor Jensen suggested earlier that surely she should focus on trying to unite ASEAN so that they could address, I think he meant Myanmar, excuse me if I got that wrong, Trevor, as a bloc. And so that's kind of perhaps I can answer that as well, right? I mean, and I guess my view here is that I think all this talk about the splits in ASEAN, I think in some respects it's actually exaggerated, or at least the practical importance of it is exaggerated. Now, what do I mean by that? I don't mean that there aren't different views within ASEAN and that they're not struggling to work together coherently. But what I do mean is that there's actually no one within ASEAN. No, what's often behind this is that Westerners in particular, they want ASEAN to behave more like we do, right? They want to push harder, maybe apply sanctions and so on. And this is where I'm trying to make my point, if I can get to it. There's nobody in ASEAN. There's a few individuals, Mahathir is suggesting a few times over the years that we should just throw Myanmar out and so forth, right? But as far as I can see, there are no governments within ASEAN that are harder than moderate. And what do I mean by that? I mean that basically what they all agree on, as far as I can see, rhetorically they're different, but what they all agree on essentially is that we need some kind of settlement that, in a traditional sense, that it deals with the interest of everybody involved, right? So there's nobody in ASEAN, at least that publicly has had any governments that have suggested that they see the way forward as being in some way contributing to the fall of the military government, right? They're looking for a more traditional political settlement. And I actually don't think there's disagreement on that within ASEAN. I think they could all go along with that, right? So I think we need to be careful, and I'm not saying that, Trevor, that you see this any differently than I do necessarily, but I think we need to be careful about keep harping on about this idea that the problem is that ASEAN is disunited. I actually don't think that's the real problem. If there is a problem from a Western perspective, it is that ASEAN will just never do the kind of things that a lot of Westerners believe needs to be done in the current situation.
Thank you. Mo, did you have final remarks, or were they included in your response to the previous question?
I would echo Morten's view. I mean, I think I mentioned ASEAN collectively is holding the line. So whatever individual views or attitudes may exist based on their own domestic priorities and interests, collectively, once a decision has been made, what we've seen since October 2021 is ASEAN holding the line. And I think that is a change. And of course, the step up in the diplomatic pressure is also a change from the past.
Yes. Well, thank you both, Morten and Mo, for a wonderful discussion on a very current topic, the difficult challenges which Julie Bishop will face going forward as the UN Special Envoy. I'd like to mention for our next seminar, or next webinar on the 24th of June, we're hoping to have the voices of students and hear how their thoughts on the activation of the conscription law. So if there are any people listening in today, particularly Myanmar students, anywhere in the world who would like to join in that, and I understand there may be some difficulties from a security point of view to do that, but if they could reach out to us, we would be delighted to have you join us. If you could speak to Mei-Chel, he'll send us a message and we'll try to put together a program. I think it's a very interesting topic and one which means a lot to students, Myanmar students who have traveled overseas in particular and face the prospect of going back to face conscription. So we'd like to talk about that and hear from you about what it means for you. And So that will be it for this evening. Thank you once again to our two speakers. Thank you to everybody who's joined us and stayed online. It's been a great discussion, and we look forward to seeing you all next month. Thank you.